get those ideas across is just to, superimpose those letters, those words on top of an image of him, and maybe take the opacity down to where it's kind of see-through. But that's a great way to kind of bump up the meaning of your image and really make the type and image work together. So, integrating type and image. On 228, there's some more really good examples. There's a kind of 4 blue squares with some architecture in there, and it kind of shows different ways to mimic that image with the type that you're using, different ways to kind of play around with that. Then below that, there's some numbers that sort of mimic the human form of the guy, the photograph of the person behind it. Lots of different ways to do this. Whenever you are integrating type and image, you do have to be conscious of all the different things that you normally would with typography, such as the font. Does the feel of the font go along with the feel of the image? What about the color of the font? All these different things. Is the color, does it contrast the image? Does it blend in? Usually if, to be safe, start out with black or white, depending on, how light or dark the image is. And then, play with the colors and see if there's something that works better than that. I typically tend to use white. That's just my own preference. I don't think that's really, probably shouldn't even say that, because that's not a rule by any means. That's just usually where I start. Let's see. On 231, there's 4 squares. It's a picture with the word art. And it kind of shows 4 different ways. And that's just kind of a very basic, interesting way to show how much difference you can get just by incorporating text with an image or kind of separating them. Top left, it's art. The word art is completely inside this image. So they kind of become one image, the type and the picture together. The one next to that, art, is kind of offset, where part of it's on the image and part of it's not. And that almost creates a sense of depth, as if the word art is in front of the image. Whereas before they're kind of integrated as one image, and the one below that where they're completely separated, it's still kind of a flat plane. But when you start to layer things, you really sort of get this sense of depth. And then you can explore other things with shadows and using certain colors to recede and certain colors to come forward. It's really fun to get in there and start playing around. Once you start to understand some of these rules, and you realize the power that you have whenever you're doing this. So let's see what else. On 232, gives you lots of examples. Goes back to the grid. Gives you lots of examples of just different ways to mix it up, to organize the grid. It doesn't have to be boring just because it's in the grid format, and this kind of shows you that. Another really cool thing, if you have a grid layout and it's kind of boring, or it's not popping like you want it to, take that picture out of the box. If you have a picture in there that's in just a square, maybe do a silhouette of it, and you'll learn how to do this once you get into some of the page layout programs. But on 234 and 235, it shows a picture. It's the grid system on a white page with a silhouette of like a mountain climber or something. And that is just a really easy, quick way to make whatever layout you have more dynamic. And as an example of that, on 234, look at the bottom. There's kind of it looks like a 2-page spread. On the right side, it's just 3 columns with images within those columns, like lavender background. And it's kind of boring. It's kind of just there, presenting the information, nothing too flashy. But if you look at the other side of that spread, you see how that box that has the lamp and the plant and everything in it, see how they kind of brought that out? They took it out of the box within the column and kind of made it not a silhouette, but just took it out of the box. And so it extends into both of these columns, and it kind of becomes an object. And that's, just looking at them, you can see how much more dynamic the page on the left is compared to the page on the right. So that's a really neat way to do that. And then you can even wrap text around an image like that, so it creates even more of an interplay. So keep that in mind. All right, layout systems. This is pretty important because a lot of graphic design is not just a one-off. It's not, you're not just doing one piece. The vast majority of design that you're going to do is part of a series. And I don't necessarily mean a clear-cut series like you're thinking. It's part of a larger entity, part of a larger brand. For instance, if you're doing an advertisement for Mercedes, they've got this whole brand integrity that they've built up over however many years they've been around that you have to kind of fit inside of. And that was kind of a big problem. Not a big problem, but that was a stumbling block for me when I first started, because I wanted to do, I had all these great ideas and I wanted to do this out there stuff. And a lot of clients don't want you to do that. They have a specific brand that you need to adhere to. And it took me a little while, but there are ways to introduce your own creativity to those. You just have to be a little more creative in your creativity. I don't know. But anyway, so you have this kind of framework that you have to work within, whether it's brand colors that you have to keep in mind or a certain layout that they use. And you can actually create this yourself if you're starting from scratch. And keeping this in mind, whenever you're doing your first design, keep the end result in mind. Keep the future. How is this going to play out? If you're doing a postcard, how is this going to play out into a poster or a TV commercial or a billboard or a website? And you want to make it, you don't want to design yourself into a corner. You don't want to make it too difficult on yourself when these things need to be developed down the road, especially if you're going to be the one developing them. It's good to think about that in advance. And on 236 and 237, it kind of gives you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's see. The brochure, the Integrind brochure that's got red, like a red page and a white page, that's an example of sort of a corporate branding kind of thing, where everything maybe has that same kind of stark, plain layout, and architectural photos or something. Maybe that's how they keep their brand integrity. Across from that, there's a bunch of Home Choice Digital Home Network logos, and that's kind of a color branding thing, a color system. We talked about that a little bit when we made color palettes a few chapters back, and that's just a way you can create variety within your brand, but it still has that integrity, that recognition to that brand. Talks about this is kind of like modular designing. That's one way to put it. There's an example of a website on the right side of page 237, and it kind of shows you this modular design system where there's an image place, there's a place for thumbnails, there's a place for info over on the side, and all of this makes it easy to switch out. Where you can have so many pages with multiple different amounts of information, but you can still get all of that in there on the page. So that's a neat way to do that. Design systems, it's basically ways to have lots of different kinds of information be recognized as part of a whole. And if you can do that without doing the straightaway ways that I would, like the same color or the same font or the same image, something like that. If you can do that in more creative ways, like for example on 239, there are two kind of spreads. One with the guy's face in black and white, and one with the guy in a gas mask or something. And if you look at these, there's not really much similarity in the subject matter. There's a blue bar going across the top of both of them, and the text is in sort of similar ways. But I mean, they're not really a whole lot similar, but they still feel part of like they're part of a whole. And that's really tricky to do, but it's quite an accomplishment if you can find a way to do that. So whenever you're doing this, there are different strategies that you can use to create this. One way is to create one piece, create however you want to create it, and then look at it and see, examine all the different elements. What is the font saying? What kind of feel does this give? What about the layout? Does it create a dynamic sense of motion or kind of a static, subdued kind of feeling? What about the colors? Is there a color that you can play throughout, into the future? And And the thing that you do with that is